Welcome everyone to Impact Dashboard Confidential. My name is Paul Shurin, and I'm a partner with Impact Data Source. Thank you for joining us today, and this is the first of our five-part webinar series where we're going to hear from some of our Impact Dashboard users. And so today we have with us Jenny Phillip from the Greater Houston Partnership. And we're going to hear how she uses Impact Dashboard in her role as the Director of Research for that organization. And then over the next month, we can see listed out here, we've got several other Impact Dashboard users from across the country. You can see the schedule. I'm gonna turn things over to Jenny here in just a moment, but let me kind of mention a couple things. The first one I wanted to point out is that you'll need to register for each webinar individually rather than getting everybody loaded up with all 5 webinars and committing. If you're interested in following along for all 5 weeks, you'll have to sign up for each one of those. If you want, you can just send me an email, honestly, and I can get you signed up if it's kind of a pain, which if you're interested in seeing all of those, it would be. We'll also have kind of a recap at the end as well with videos of these. So we'll make sure anybody that's on this first one will get copied on that. So when I say you can email me, it's just paul@impactdatasource.com. Very easy. So just to give a little bit of a background here, let me kind of set the stage and explain who I am and what Impact Dashboard is. So as I mentioned, I'm Paul Shurin. I'm an economist with Impact Data Source. Many of you may know my partner, Jerry Walker. Jerry started the company in 1993, so we're coming up on actually about 25 years of experience here evaluating economic development projects of all different types. And so we're going to look at one aspect of what we do here. So we kind of work a couple different ways. One way is we license software to clients. Excuse me. So our clients can do their own studies. And so that's what Jenny does. The Greater Houston Partnership uses Impact Dashboard throughout the year to kind of run analyses as they need. But we also can prepare the impact studies on an as-needed basis, so kind of one by one instead of at the annual subscription type thing. A couple other things to note that we have going on are 2 different economic development podcasts. One is Economic Development Secrets, where my colleague Nicole D'Souza interviews economic developers from around the country, or even different economic development leaders from across the country. And then we also have a podcast called 123 CECD, and that one is more geared toward economic developers working toward their CEC designation. So before I turn it over to Jenny here, let me just kind of give a brief overview of exactly what we're talking about with Impact Dashboard. So essentially, Impact Dashboard is an online app that we developed to help economic developers evaluate projects. And so you can evaluate prospective business locations or expansions. And through that, we're going to look at the economic impacts to try to figure out, the spin-off jobs, that type of thing that might be generated from a particular project. And then we're going to tie that back into the taxes and the revenues and even the costs that that new project would generate for the city, the county, the school district, all the relevant taxing entities. And then if it's applicable, as it often is for economic development, is if you're thinking about incentives, we want to be able to kind of wrap that into this analysis too. So if you're thinking about a tax abatement, we want to be able to layer that into the analysis. If there's some sort of grant, infrastructure grant or something like that, we want to be able to calculate that return on investment and so forth. So if you're looking for just kind of some basic information about what Impact Dashboard is, we do a monthly webinar on that. It's called Impact Dashboard Live. We do it the first Thursday of every month, which happens to be tomorrow. It's already February here. So tomorrow there'd be an Impact Dashboard Live that occurs at the same time, 1 p.m. Central. So if you want to just get the basics on what Impact Dashboard is, we can we can meet over there tomorrow. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny. But if you have questions as we go along for either for Jenny or for me, whatever, you can type those into the questions box there on the GoToWebinar panel. And just to be clear, we are recording this, so we'll make the video available to everyone once we're finished here. So with that, I am going to hand this over to Jenny to take it over and present what she has. Let me see.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Let me get my screen set up. All right, can everybody see my slides? Or Paul, can you confirm?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. There are several participants who I noticed on the attendee list who may not be familiar with the Greater Houston Partnership, so I'll do, the quick spiel on that. We are an organization that represents the 11-county Houston region, and there are three main components of the organization. One is the Economic Development Organization, many of you who represent your community's EDO. We also have a public policy arm, and then the third branch is more of that traditional Chamber of Commerce where we represent the Houston business community. I'm in the research division where we consider ourselves the in-house consultants to these groups, the EDO, the PPD, and the public policy, and the Chamber of Commerce. And we also work to provide data analysis on the Houston economy, the demographics of our region, and share that with the broader community and media. So we've been using Impact Data Source, the model, for about over a decade. We started out using it in its traditional Excel format, just a spreadsheet where you input data. And then when the web model became available, we switched over to that format 2 years ago. So primarily today I'll be discussing our usage of the web model. But a lot of the underlying methodology and thoughts into running the model is similar to whether or not you use a web model or the Excel spreadsheet. So quick overview of what we'll discuss today, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. The first is, why does the partnership use Impact Data Source and specifically Impact Dashboard? What's our typical workflow for running an impact? How do we use the reports at the end? And what's an example of a workaround when we run into an issue with the web model? So diving right in. So first off, why do we use Impact Data Source? One of the biggest reasons is because it allows us to produce detailed impacts for all the taxing jurisdictions in the Houston area. And oftentimes the city or county that is requesting this report when they're evaluating a project. The report itself allows them to see the net benefits across the various taxing jurisdictions and then helps aid them in producing their final incentive package or abatement package. The model also acts for the partnership as like a third-party stamp of approval. And for Impact Data Source, it's fairly well known in Texas, especially in the economic development realm. So it's helpful to be able to have that stamp from a well-known, respected organization. The web-based model specifically, it's very user-friendly. For many of you who've worked in it, will be able to understand just how easy it is to use. And the final reports that they produce, they're auto-generated. That's another process that is simplified by using the web model. Another aspect that we enjoy about the web model is that it's let me also preface this. I'm not getting any commission off of this. So this is just purely what I've noticed in our usage that has been useful. And because I do enjoy using the model, I'm happy to provide this webinar. So we understand that there are no two economic development projects that are the same. So another benefit of the web model is that there's the ability to modify some of the assumptions that are used. And we'll go into details on that later in the presentation. And finally, Paul, and he's probably embarrassed that I'm doing this, but he's a big reason why we use a model. He's very easy to work with and takes his time to discuss any methodological issues we have when there are certain projects that are a little bit different that just require us to talk through the theory of economic impact and how it can apply in the model. Now, if there's only one thing that you're to take away from this webinar is to remember that what you put in is what you get out. Your final impacts are only as valid as the inputs that you use. Any monkey can punch numbers into a box. Running the model only takes a few minutes, but really the work is everything that happens before and after you use the model. The true challenge is understanding the project you're modeling. What does the impact mean? Are you using valid inputs and assumptions? And you really need to start at a base question. The first question you should always ask yourself, should I even be running an impact? Is this project eligible? Have a conversation among your group, among your team, and discuss what are the types of projects that your organization wants to evaluate and would want to produce an impact for. I know, for example, at the partnership, we only calculate impacts for projects that create a demand from outside the Houston region for goods and services produced inside the region. We want to make sure that it's a true injection of outside funds into the local economy, which then produces a meaningful impact. Only then will we actually go through and run the model for the project. So of course, not all requests are eligible, not all projects are eligible. So you want to sit back and really discuss with your team which projects are true economic impact providers for your region or your community. And of course, it's all about the assumptions. When I say junk in, junk out, it's the data that you input into the model that matters and influences what that final report looks like. So there are two ways that you can go about collecting data on this project, on your project. One is doing it straight through the website. So after you've logged in to Impact Data Source and you've begun to create a project, there's a request data button, and that just allows you to go ahead and send directly to your point of contact, either through the company or site consultant, the data form in the data sheet. Another option, a little bit more old school, is to use the Excel file. We actually prefer this version. Allows us to kind of keep tab of it on our end, and also many of our users also like to use it through Excel. So it's really just preference. There's no right or wrong for this. One main thing that you want to remember is that when you receive these requests, that you want to build in time for any delays in receiving this data from the site consultant or the company. So like I said, it only takes a few minutes to actually input the data. It takes much longer to sit and evaluate that information, and sometimes even longer to get the data. And there might be some reluctance in sharing a lot of what the company considers proprietary information. So you want to assure them of the confidentiality of this information. So once you receive your intake form, here are a few tips that, as we've worked through many projects, that I feel like could be useful in what we do. The first thing is to truly understand the project. At the partnership, the research team, as I mentioned, we service, not just economic development, but public policy, the membership team, and, our external clients. So really, it's the economic development project manager that is working that project from start to finish. Oftentimes, we're brought in maybe in the RFI process or RFP process, and then sometimes we're brought in for the impact. And that's the first time we may hear of that project. So it's important to sit down with that economic development manager. It's important to understand the details of that project before starting the impact. You don't just want to input the data as received. You want to take the time to truly understand the project. So two things that are typically misrepresented in the input form, and it's good to provide that clarity prior to sending out the intake form, are the location and the NAICS. So you want to make sure that the location that the company provides is the actual site of the project. Sometimes they might provide the address of where they're currently officing, and then not the actual address of where the expansion or relocation is occurring. And of course, you need that correct location, because those are what generates the taxing jurisdictions and finally the overall economic impact. In terms of the NAICS categorization, and this is the North American Industrial Classification System, the industry code that's used to define the operations of that project. You want to make sure to distinguish between the NAICS that perhaps the company traditionally operates under and what will be happening during the expansion or relocation or project. Oftentimes, those could be the same thing. But then there are instances where, for example, it could be a manufacturing company, but the project is actually a relocation or expansion of their corporate offices, and it doesn't actually entail any additional manufacturing activity. So then that's when you would actually use the corporate office NAICS and not the manufacturing NAICS. So you want to make sure that that distinction is clear. It's also very common to receive incomplete intake forms. You can try your hardest and do your best to get every single data field included, but oftentimes the company themselves may not even know what their taxable purchases in the local city or community will be. It's fine not to have all the fields filled out. You'll want to include in your project description which fields were not included in the process so that it informs the final reader what they know was missing from the input into the model. The most critical pieces that you want to include are, of course, the address, a project description, the job creation numbers, the salary that's associated with those jobs, the capital expenditure, and the industry code. Those are the critical pieces. The other items, such as the taxable purchase and the inventory, you can still run a viable economic impact assessment without those pieces. But like I said, you will want to notate that in your project description. The final tip for reviewing the intake form is to do a gut check. You work in economic development, you work in your community, you've seen these projects come through. Do the capital expenditure numbers seem correct? Are the job numbers and salary numbers, in alignment with what you would typically expect with this kind of level of project? And sometimes typos happen, right? It's completely fine to go back and say, did you mean to include that extra zero? And so it's important to just, go through, scan it through with a detailed eye, provide that gut check. And once you feel the data points are correct, that's the time that you can go through and input them into the model. And Impact Data Source provides two options for how we can report that out. One is a detailed report and a summary, and the other is a summary report. But along the way, as you're inputting the data into the model, there's a summary report that updates live as you input different items into the web model. So you can see, what an additional 1,000 jobs would do, or what an additional $1 million in CapEx would do for your taxing jurisdictions. And those numbers will fluctuate as you make those changes. And it's kind of a neat tool to be able to see that. Now, the final reports that you would actually share with your groups would be, one is a summary report. And this is just a one-page document that you can PDF, send out as a hard copy or email, and typically it will only show the benefit to one of the jurisdictions, usually the county or the city. I like the detailed report. I'm going to screenshot, or I provided screenshots of the two tables and charts that our users typically focus in on. The cities and counties really enjoy seeing what the benefit, what the cost is, and then bringing that to a present value. That's really what helps inform them in how to structure their incentive packages. There's a visualization of this too, where you can see how this is divided out among all the different taxing jurisdictions. So there is a tab in the web model which allows you to look at, to model the incentives, but from our end, we like to produce it without that information in there, just so that it's a clear picture of only what the impact would be as a result of the project. One thing that we did encounter when we ran the web model was that there was some issues with scaling when we changed from HTML to PDF. And so this is just a reminder, scaling meaning that the number that was provided on the table, for example here, was not what matched the actual graph. So you just want to keep in mind that this web model is created by humans and glitches occur. And the great thing, and this is why I said one of the reasons that we use this is because of the availability of Paul to be able to handle these situations, address them fairly quickly, and make sure that the model is continually updated with user feedback and just improved over several iterations. And so that open line of communication is not something that we have typically encountered when working with other models where the only customer support that you could get might be just shooting off an email and hoping for a response in time for your deadline. One example of a modification that we typically have to do in the model, and as I mentioned, every project is so different, so what we enjoy about the web model is the ability to make these modifications. You'll see that at the top right, when you enter in your web model, that there's a guide and then an image of a gear. The guide is a great user manual, essentially, of telling you what impact data source has assumed to run the model. And that's important because at the end of the day, ultimately, you're held accountable for these results. And so you will be asked questions about the assumptions that you used in the model, even if it was what was the default that was provided by Impact Dashboard. For the end user of the report, they're going to look at you and ask you what were the assumptions. So it's important to educate yourself to know that, okay, 50% of the construction funds go to labor and the other 50% goes to materials, right? Or, what was the inflation rate that was used? What was the depreciation rate? And so it's important to read through that guide and understand those assumptions. Now, the other area is the gear. That gear allows you to change the assumptions that are used for the scenarios. You have the ability to edit the defaults, which is a really great option because every project is so different. Now, of course, when you edit the defaults, what's nice is that you can reset the defaults. So you can also run different scenarios, which allows you to be able to print out all these different final outcomes and have the scenarios clearly labeled, explain also the different default settings that may have changed. And this allows you to be able to model kind of a base case scenario, maybe a high case or a low case, depending on what's being demanded from that project. Now, the other benefit of having the scenario assumptions change in this setup is at the very bottom, there's a notes box. And that notes box allows you and other users within your group to know what changes were made so that if they had to replicate it or have to explain to the final recipient of the report what changes were made to the default, all of that is notated at the bottom. You just need to remember to make sure to notate that. So one example of a workaround, and as I mentioned, the web model is kind of the basic project that you would run. And because every project is so different, you'll have to sometimes do a workaround. Now, a common issue that we encounter is that there is no city taxing jurisdiction. It may be physically located in what we would consider, the city of Houston, or what a layman would understand as the city of Houston. But in terms of the actual taxing jurisdiction that would be placed on that property, City of Houston is sometimes not there. So if you're working on a project where you don't have a city, the problem is that the web model bases everything off of the city. Now, the workaround to do that, and what you see here is that you get no benefits, because if there is no city entered, the model will not compute. So what you can do is go in to the drop down of the city, force a city name in there, so just put City of Houston in there. Then that will actually allow you to enter in your actual NAICS code. That's when you go back and then you can see that the NAICS was picked up. You see a multiplier that was actually included. And then after you see that the multiplier was included, you can remove the City of Houston again. So once again, that doesn't show any impact to the taxing jurisdiction, but then the model will then pick up all of the impacts to the other taxing jurisdictions. So it's almost like a trigger that it's the workaround, kind of the manipulation of the model to trigger it to run the impact, even though there is truly no city taxing jurisdiction. So that's one of those like in the weed modifications. We don't need to go to too many details of that, but it's just an example of if you encounter an issue when you're running the impact, that there are ways to work around it. And if you struggle with it, one thing to always remember is that you can always call Paul, or you can email Paul, and he will be able to work with you through it, or at least get you in touch with a team member that can help address the issue, and also communicate suggestions to the team on how to improve on the web model. So, as a community of users, it's great to be able to work together and produce this, a model that through various iterations can address many of the needs that we have in the projects that we work. So with that, I'm available for any questions.
Thanks, thanks, Jenny. Sorry, I was trying to get off mute there, but I'm looking at the questions here. So if anybody has questions, you can type those in. We've got one here first. I'll let Jenny, you can answer this from your perspective of, will you ever adjust the multipliers for a particular project? Or do you always just take the ones that are built in that come up from that lookup on the NAICS code?
No, we will not adjust the multipliers. And the main reason being is what I had mentioned in terms of this third-party stamp of approval, is because we don't want to be, when the final report is put out, it could be next month when City Council asks questions, or next year or 3 years later, and they'll want to know, why did the partnership go through and modify a multiplier that is generally accepted from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, their RIMS-2 model, the same model that communities across the United States uses for this industry code? Why is it that the partnership made that change? So for us, no, we will not change the multiplier on it. If it's strange, if there's something odd about it, that's a conversation, of course, you can have with Paul, or you can look into it. What we have a benefit of using too is we also use InPlan. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about. It's not necessarily a straight competitive project, but or a product, because InPlan is only for a geography and not for a taxing jurisdiction. But we have the ability to see how that multiplier is broken out across induced impacts and indirect impacts, in which industries are the main benefits of that multiplier. And that's where that gut check plays in, where we see, okay, does that multiplier make sense for our geography, for our industry makeup, for our economy? But at the end of the day, no, we do not modify the multipliers. And the biggest reason is because we don't want to have any questions and credibility in the report that we produce. At most, we'll change, the scenario of assumptions in terms of, number of jobs, CapEx, and that is something that we want to document to make sure the company has signed off on as a viable input into the model.
Thanks, Jay. I guess we've got a couple other questions here, but I'll stick with the idea of multipliers. The question was on whether the multipliers are InPlan or RIMS-2. The short answer there is that they're RIMS-2. Yep. You can, if you have InPlan, if for some other reason you're trying to line something up with an InPlan study, you always have the ability to overwrite the multiplier, so you can enter custom multipliers essentially. But as Jenny kind of alluded to, there is the direction or the end result of what you're doing with Impact Dashboard versus InPlan is a little bit different. InPlan is really solid on economic impacts and providing a lot of extra detail on as Jenny mentioned, where indirect and induced and separating some of those out even by industries, where Impact Dashboard is really trying to help economic developers skip past all of the hard economic impact stuff and really get to what they're trying to understand is really, from an economic developer's perspective, the real value of this project. So going getting to the point of the tax revenues by jurisdiction. Let me see. There's a couple others here. Jenny, can you talk about how to request? So can you show us how to request information from the client again? Is there a PDF or Excel version we can download? And so in Jenny's case, so Impact Dashboard has this built into it. Jenny has an Excel file that we provided just to help do this kind of outside of the app if that was desired. So Jenny, you can talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. So I think I'm going to move this over. What you're looking at here is when you sign in, when you create a new project, you can type in here, and once you've created that new project and it shows up at the bottom, you can request data there. And then that's where you can enter in the email address and send that off. The other option was through the Excel form. And that's something you can receive from Paul when you set up your account, and then you can go through and have that sent to the project manager or the site consultant.
Great, thanks. Here's a question for you, Jenny. At Greater Houston Partnership, is this primarily used to formulate incentive packages, or is it presented to city county representatives to lobby support for projects?
It's a combination of both, depending on the project. There's a whole wide reason of why they would ask for this. Typically, it is for the structuring of incentives so that they understand, for example, when you look at these final benefits, right, for this project, that the city of Houston should probably not offer anything more than $3.5 million, right, over a 10-year period, so that there is a fairly strong understanding of what they could receive if all of these different job creation and CapEx numbers were hit. At most a net benefit of 3.5 brought to the present value 2.7 million, and so that kind of gives them a guidepost of how they could structure those incentives, and then work with the company on what that would look like.
Great. So we have a question from another user, and I don't, maybe, well, you can give an answer to this, and maybe I will too. And it says, I run a model for each project before it happens. I've asked if we should run a report post-project. What are your thoughts on running multiple reports through the course of the project?
That's interesting. So I haven't used the model for that before. It would be interesting to track over time. You can see, how, but then you want to make sure that the timeline of it is as it was described when initially brought up, right? So sometimes the job creation or the CapEx is front-loaded into year 1 and year 2. So you want to make sure that just because the company, said that they would have 10 million in construction in year 1 and 20 in year 2, that it's, so the tricky thing about that is actually being able to get the data. And I think that's a big part of the reason why we haven't done it, is because once the project has been announced and the company is moving forward and there's no incentive package that is on the line in terms of them having to provide this data to us, it's harder to get information from that company so that we can follow up and see. I mean, of course, there's the clawback provisions once those incentives are provided, where you can follow through and see what that spending is. But you do want to take into account that there are changes year to year in how construction is done, how much actually is spended, and that's why it's important to understand these are assumptions, illustrations, almost modeling it, from my perspective, modeling it every year can create a difficult situation, at least for the partnership, where we are not the ones that are holding that company accountable. It's more for the city and the county or whoever has provided that incentive to hold them accountable for that job creation and for the CapEx. The impact that is resulting from it, that's always just a modeled assumption. And so really we can show, like, okay, so far this is what we've done and what may have been generated in the economy, but in terms of the partnership standing in that, it would just be the modeling of it. And it would be the city and county that would have to go through and work more on the actual, what was stated in the agreement for the structured incentives.
Yeah, and I would kind of echo that in the sense that it can be difficult to get the kind of information as the project unfolds. But if you are in the situation where you have maybe annual reporting requirements for a project, I would suggest that you tie those annual reporting requirements, to what you're actually trying to evaluate over time with these updated reports, so to speak. So if you're maybe the incentive was entirely based on, I'll just make something. If it was all based on the capital investment, you would want to get verification of the capital investment for sure, as based on that agreement. But then, in order to kind of keep running these, you might also need verification on the employment level, because you want to be able to accurately reflect that over time. And so this idea of being able to do a kind of a post analysis, or even kind of an in process analysis, maybe being able to update it each year and show, are you above or below what you were projecting, and being able to dig in a little bit as to why that was. Either the company's in trouble, or maybe this modeling wasn't right. That's something that we're hoping to kind of implement and add to Impact Dashboard over time. It's not in the next 6 months or so, but it's definitely something we want to be able to do to allow our clients, when you are maybe able to collect that information, to do that comparison, to say, look, this is what we projected going in, and now we're 3 months in, or excuse me, 3 years into this. How does that compare? How are they doing? And even help you if you're seeing that maybe it was some sort of element where the company wasn't hitting their targets. They said they were going to hire 100 people, but they only hired 90. And if it does come to that point of like a clawback, how do you handle that? And this is work that we've done individually for clients, help them evaluate to say, look, they're not holding up their end of the bargain, but how mad should we be at them, so to speak? And that would be to kind of run an analysis that shows, look, they're still hitting their overall targets, because even though their employment impact was less, maybe their capital investment or the construction spend turned out to be more, that kind of thing. So that's the that's some of the experience that we've had there. I'm going to do one last question here, Jenny, and we'll see. So we know it depends on the industry and project, but do you try to keep track of, or excuse me, do you try to keep the payback period of incentives within the same range? For example, like a 1, 3, 5, 7-year break even. Jenny, in your experience, I guess you're not using this too much for incentives, or do you eventually go back and layer that in if a community kind of tells you this is what we're going to do? Do you get into the incentives with the way that you're using?
No. So on the research end, we stop here. Like, we provide them that purely from the project perspective, this is what you can expect to generate in terms of an impact. There is the option to layer in, as I had mentioned, that second tab, the middle tab of the project, where you can go. Here, let me pull that up and model that public support, right? And see how that changes over time. So from our end, once we turn it over to the city, county, the economic development project manager then works with them on it, but we don't come back and model that through here, although it is an option. I think some of it just gets a little bit too dicey and tricky.
Yeah, and I guess my generic answer on this, just to answer the question here, is that it does vary. Depends on maybe the guidelines or the incentive guide that the particular organization has developed. And so maybe working with their board, if it's an EDC in Texas, let's say, if you're working with your board and you've decided, look, these are our target industries, and for any project we look at, we need a 3-year payback period, or whatever it might be. And so it's really we see our clients kind of trying to define things that way, or it's helpful to get everybody kind of in agreement when we put it in those terms. So we've seen some of that, but whether it's, as you kind of pointed out, 1, 3, 5, or 7, we've seen it kind of across the spectrum. Some folks are happy enough with like a 10-year payback period. So as long as it's 10 years, they won't do anything over 10, but they'll go up to 10 years on the right type of project. Others, it would be much less. I know one of our clients where they have a lot of lease property, what they'll do is look at, or projects that are leasing property, they'll make the payback period, or they won't consider a payback period that's anything longer than 1/2 of the lease period, right? So whatever that, if they're signing a 7-year lease, our client wants a 3.5-year payback period. So at least there's, just as much in the, where you're in the black, as opposed to when you're still trying to earn that incentive back. So that's just a little bit of a kind of from my perspective of what I see our clients doing. But I think we kind of ran through all these questions, Jenny. I really appreciate your help in kind of showing how your organization uses this. And as you mentioned, I was blushing, but I'm going to show my mom this webinar when we're done. She'll be really excited.
Well, thanks for having me, and it's nice to be able to share kind of across the community. I look forward to listening to the other webinars as well, just to hear how different organizations and different communities use it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jenny, and thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks so much.
Thank you.